What is the story of America? Is there such a thing? Is there only one story, or are there many stories? And if there are many stories, how are they woven? Can they be woven together to tell the story of America? Those are the questions we'll seek answers to here in this ongoing conversation, the third installment of Dr. Andrew Roth's The American Tapestry Project. We tell ourselves stories as now we turn our attention to freedom's fault lines, the stories of race and gender. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan, and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson, and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me is Dr. Roth, a scholar in residence at the Jefferson, and the host of the American Tapestry Project radio program airing on WQLN Public Media and available online at WQLN.org and on the NPR One app. Now, after a deep examination of 1968, the year America shattered, according to Smithsonian magazine, Dr. Roth launched his exploration of the American narrative, or narratives. In August, Dr. Roth and I took a look at the overview of his American Tapestry project, and on September 29th, we began looking more deeply into Dr. Roth's project, looking at the weaving of that tapestry thread by thread over the course of several episodes as we examine that American narrative. Now, videos of past programs, as well as other discussions featuring Dr. Roth, are available for on-demand streaming at jeserie.org. In past episodes, we have examined humans as storytellers and freedom's story at home in the U.S. and abroad. In this episode, we're turning our attention to freedom's fault lines, looking at America's story with race and gender through our past and into our present. Quick note on Dr. Roth. Prior to joining the Jefferson, he had an accomplished career in academia, from lecturing to leading. He taught various courses before going on to serve in administrations in Erie and lead Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president, before retiring and being named president emeritus. Now, breaking free from the tightening grip of retirement, as I often put it, Dr. Roth heeded the call to serve again and led as the interim president of St. Bonaventure University. Now, seeing his vulnerability when it comes to maintaining a relationship with retirement, we at the Jefferson wrangled him in, where he's been serving as a scholar in residence ever since, offering numerous lectures, producing plenty of publications, including his book note series, which is available at jeserie.org, and facilitating the Ramey Fellowship Program. Now, since this conversation is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to still send us your questions, engage us in dialogue, and we will get them along to Dr. Roth so we can keep the conversation going. Of course, for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Andrew Roth, thank you for continuing this conversation and joining me for part 3 of the American Tapestry Project series.
Good afternoon, Ben. It's hard to believe we're on part 3 already. Time flies, as they say, to start swapping some cliches. Anyways, today, part 3, Freedom's Fault Lines, Stories of Race and Gender. Just very briefly to recap what we've talked about in the first 2 episodes that listeners can find on the Jefferson website and on Facebook. The American Tapestry Project, the warp threads, and I'm not going to get into the analysis of weaving, but the threads that hold it all together, we'll call them the foundational threads: freedom, equality, and opportunity, ongoing experiment in self-government, blending diverse people into a people, as in we the people. Those are the foundational threads, to avoid the jargon of weaving for a moment. And those foundational threads hold together at least 5 or 6 major themes or thread themes, or that themselves have multiple sub-themes. As we will discover today, we're going to look at 4 sub-themes in Freedom's Fault Lines, and I'll let the audience look at these quickly. We tell ourselves stories, freedom at home and abroad, we discussed last week. Next week, we're going to look at the American dream, particularly focusing on the materialistic side of it, business and the Horatio Alger. Then, of course, the immigrant's tale and the fusion thread, as we try to develop or in some way assimilate into a coherent whole, diverse people from all over the world, in that ever-expanding definition of we the people. But today, we're going to look at Freedom's Fault Lines, Stories of Race and Gender, and we're rather quickly going to discover that each of these 4 things could simply be an episode unto itself. And so we're going to be doing a bit of skating today. Today we'll look at Native Americans, indigenous people, and their experience after the European discovery of what becomes known as the North American continent. Native Americans, many of them, interestingly enough, called it Turtle Island, by which they meant all of reality. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about the African American experience that began in 1619. And one of the interesting things we've discovered in this series, when I gave this talk, or a version of this talk several years ago at the Jefferson, I think it was actually in 1619, so it had been last year, I had to explain why 1619 was important. And now, that date, which had been a fairly obscure date in American history, at least with the proverbial man on the street, is now a date everyone knows about and is arguing about. And we're going to look at the women's movement, and we're going to look at those who might resist some of this, those who espouse a kind of white supremacy. And so all four of those things, freedoms, fault lines, tales of race and gender, how the excluded argued for inclusion by appealing to America's foundational ideals we talked about on that earlier slide, and how those who would exclude them denied those ideals. And we're going to talk about how the stories of all of these are important because, as we've said in the previous 2 weeks, and we'll let people look at, revisit those episodes rather than going into any deep dive, but it's important because humans are storytellers, and the stories they tell themselves about the American story is the story that holds America together, or we hope holds America together as a coherent culture. And as you mentioned in the introduction, ever since, well, 1968 is a nice placeholder, but ever since 1968, there's been the sense that somehow that story shattered or fragmented. And of course, why is any of this important? Well, it's because we are storytellers, and the stories we tell ourselves make sense. And that led to Pat Buchanan's declaring a culture war in 1992 at the Republican Convention. So on the one hand, and again, this is kind of a shorthand and an oversimplification, there are those who would like to have frozen American history sometime in the late 1950s in a kind of white bread Protestant America, which, as anyone who grew up or lived through that period of time or has taken the trouble to study it knows, it was a little more complicated than that, but that's the cliched version. And that, of course, is fought out most importantly in terms of the culture wars. The culture wars are really about whose story defines America, and arguably one of the most important versions of that's history wars, and that's as fresh as today's newspaper. In this morning's Erie Times, Leonard Pitts, a columnist from the Miami Herald, but part of the USA Today network, talked about how white people seem to forever be telling him they didn't know. Well, we have the current presidential administration banning multicultural teaching in federally funded organizations. And Heather Cox Richardson, an esteemed contemporary historian, in her daily newsletter, Letter from an American, talks about how the president's recent statements, and by recent I mean yesterday, recent statements about Columbus Day are a mangled mishmash, because he apparently thinks of Columbus Day as a triumph of, again, white Protestant America, not understanding that perhaps that Christopher Columbus was a man of Italian ancestry, and I'm not so sure to the extent he was practicing, but he was at least a nominal Roman Catholic. And that Columbus Day wasn't initially started as a holiday in the 1920s. I think Roosevelt made it an official holiday in 1934, but don't hold me to that date. It was really a reaction to the anti-Italian, anti-Southern Eastern European immigration behavior of the early 1920s. And it was actually founded to assert the legitimacy of those people immigrating to the United States, and to celebrate their culture, and to link their culture to American history. And so, you know, it's an ongoing argument. I mean, whose story? And of course, the biggest one, as we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the date 1619, as recently as 2019, certainly 2018, if you'd have asked the proverbial 100 people, the first 100 people you met on the street, what happened in 1619, 98 of them would have scratched their head. One would have mumbled something about colonial Virginia, and maybe one would have known what you were asking him about. And here we are a scant 2 years later, and it's become a flashpoint in the culture wars. Did American history begin in 1619, or did it begin in 1776? Because the president has created a commission to tell the miracle of the founding of America. And so history is not irrelevant, as we're going to discover. History is the prime story that we tell ourselves. Stories are important in a kind of macroscopic way, because the stories that endure, I'm not going to get into literary criticism and arguing aesthetics with anyone, but so I'll avoid a word like great, but the stories that endure basically, in some manner, shape, or form, do one or all three of three things. They tell the people where they came from, they tell the people who they are, and they give some idea of where those people might be going into the future. And whether it's the book of Genesis or pick whatever story you want to tell, you'll find that template. And that's what this argument's really about. Who are we? Where did we come from? Or maybe phrase that maybe in the right order. Where did we come from? Who are we? And what might we become? And of course, the argument is all about the fact we no longer agree what it means to be an American, and we don't seem to even have a common understanding of what Columbus Day is, other than a Monday off in October. And that takes us to freedom's fault lines, what we're going to talk about today. And I need to make a couple of observations, at least one observation real quickly. I mean, as these little internet memes, if you will, that I picked up to do it. We're going to talk about Native Americans, indigenous people. We're going to talk about gender. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about white supremacy. Each one of these could be a presentation unto itself. And there's a ton of information that we're going to admittedly somewhat surf over in this next 45, 50 minutes. And so I'm going to make two observations. One, I don't know if people can see it, but I'll do something I rarely do. I'm going to actually keep my notes in hand so that I don't misspeak on any of the specific details. And also, it's impossible, I mean, just literally impossible to tell the history, the complete history of any one of these. So after surfing some details, we'll do a 2 or 3 or 4 minute dive into one particular topic and move on. I don't know, does that make sense to you, Ben, on how we should proceed?
Andy, I think it does, because I think those word clouds you have on the screen really do show the density of the conversation and dialogue around each one of these particular issues. So here we are going to give that surface scratch. And in fact, in the last episode, I think we gave ourselves some homework in adding a 6th installment, Talking Tapestry, where we can unpack some of the things we did not get to. And so I think that's one of the areas that maybe we can dive a little deeper into what we're about to skim today. But this is so important for our foundational understanding. So it makes sense to me, Andy. Let's hit the ground running and start with a look at the Native Americans in America and the history there that we're taking a look at in light of the American Tapestry Project.
And of course, this has a direct Erie connection. Where we sit was once upon a time the Eries nation, the Cat people. It's actually one of the instances that you can't really lay it at the Europeans. The Cat people ended up getting subsumed into the Seneca nation when they had refused. Well, I'm not sure refused is quite the right word, but did not join the evolving Iroquois Confederacy, and then discovered that the Senecas weren't going to take that answer. That's not really what we want to talk about today, but it does at least have an Erie connection. And anyone who, as you mentioned, I was the president of St. Bonaventure University for a time, and every day driving to work, I drove by that sign on I-86 that, you're temporarily leaving the United States and now entering the Seneca Nation. The figures here, just real quickly: Sacagawea, who was with Lewis and Clark; Pocahontas, this is Metacomet, sometimes called King Philip; this Chief Joseph; Tecumseh, the Trail of Tears. We're going to take a look at all of this. And again, as I said earlier, it's impossible to tell the whole entire history of this. So we're going to look at a couple of key things. An interesting film, 1607 is First Contact. Actually, that's not completely accurate, because up in the Northeast, European fishermen on the Grand Banks had been fishing for cod well into the 16th century, if not a little earlier, and had some contact. But generally, the first real contact between Europeans and, or at least English-speaking Europeans, obviously the Spanish had been in Latin America, what came to be called Latin America, in the southern part of North America in the 16th century. But the first contact with Englishmen occurred in 1607 in Jamestown, and in a great film. It's actually a wonderful film. It shows you the power of film to create a gone world. Terrence Malick's The New World shows that first contact brilliantly. And so in 1607, you had the English. In 1621, the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. 1630, the Puritans, John Winthrop, who we refer to repeatedly in this series, and we'll come back to in The Immigrant's Tale and the what I call the fusion thread, the founding of Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. And the, shall we say, ambivalent attitude of the Europeans to the Native Americans was shown, obviously, to the south, as they would have said in those days, but the Spanish impact on native peoples. But Winthrop made an interesting comment. When the first settlers came ashore, they discovered the remnants of Indian villages that were empty. There were no people there. And what had happened, I mentioned a minute ago about European fishermen on the Grand Banks fishing for cod, had contact with the native peoples, the indigenous peoples in what is now Maine and going further north into Nova Scotia, etc. And of course, they brought with them smallpox. And so most of those villages had already been decimated by disease, and actually showing you the flavor that was going to come over the next several centuries. Winthrop considered it a providential cleansing, as if the Lord had cleansed the land of the barbarians and made it available to the Christian civilized Europeans. That's, I think, fairly arguable. That would be a debate that one could have, actually, but I suspect there's more than one point on that. And I'm not going to give the entire history, obviously, of the Pilgrims and the Puritans settling New England, but they rather quickly, although they were somewhat favorably received initially, they rather quickly overran the territory, such that the Wampanoags and the Massachusetts and others finally, organizing around Metacomet, who the English called King Philip, they attempted to cast out the Europeans, and we had King Philip's War in 1675-76, and it's probably one of the more devastating wars in American history. There is at least 600 colonists were killed, and 600 doesn't sound like a big number when there's 330 million Americans, but when you're talking about how there may have only been about 15 to 20,000, 600 is actually a big number, and 3,000 Native American women and children were killed in it. It pretty much ended any Indian resistance in what is nowadays called New England. French and Indian War is a major setback for Native Americans, because prior to the French and Indian War, the Iroquois in particular the Mohawk in what is now upstate New York, had brilliantly played off the English and the French against one another. But once the English had won and had defeated the French, the Iroquois were in an interesting position if it was them simply against the dominant English. And that put them in a difficult position, and a position that just continued to erode over time. Proclamation of 1763 prohibited white European colonization west of the Appalachian Mountains. It was an attempt by the British government to thwart the continuing seizure of Indian lands. It was in some ways, not a direct, but an indirect cause of the American Revolution, because white settlers kept pouring over the mountains regardless of this royal proclamation. Pontiac's rebellion, and this is a stylized image of Pontiac. He was an Indian chief in what is now Michigan, actually. That wouldn't have been called any of that then, but Western Ohio and along the Detroit. And there was, of course, the Battle of Fort Detroit. Pontiac's rebellion began with an attack on Fort Detroit, but of course the British won that. And the Battle of Fallen Timbers is the last real major battle between Native Americans, and then by this time, 1794-95, the new United States of America. It has an eerie connection because Mad Anthony Wayne was, of course, the hero of that. In 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe, which basically ended the Native American, the indigenous people's occupation of Ohio, where they were driven further west into, interestingly enough, a territory that was going to be reserved for them initially, Indiana. In fact, the very name of the state, Indiana, means land of the Indians. This is the Indian territory. Of course, as we know, and I guess the common thread through this first slide is if we start at the Atlantic Ocean, the native peoples kept consistently being pushed west as the Europeans just simply filled the land and took it from them. I'm going to go ahead of 2 slides, some key dates, then I'm going to come back to the Trail of Tears. All of this goes on and on. You have some major efforts to, how are the Native Americans assimilated into American culture? You know, there is the argument, is this a conquest? Is this a theft? Is this some kind of peaceful amalgamation? Well, we definitely can agree it wasn't a peaceful amalgamation, although there were some attempts. For example, this is one instance where I will be looking at some notes just to make sure I don't misspeak. The Dawes Act, as late as 1887, and it was named after Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, who interestingly enough was pro-Native American, pro-indigenous people. And what he did was allotment, there would be a general allotment of land to Native Americans, and authorized the President of the United States to subdivide Native American lands into allotments of farms and for individual households. And essentially, if a member of the tribe left the tribe and agreed to live on the farm and farm it, they would then become American citizens. And essentially, on a cultural level, it was saying to the native indigenous people, if you will become, and I don't mean white in the literal physical sense, but if you'll become white culturally, that is, settle down as farmers, living in discrete family units, you can have the land and become a citizen of the United States. Some people took him up on that. Some indigenous people took him up on that. Others did not. But, you know, there is a profound paternalistic aspect to that if you think about it even for a moment or two. And that actually spoke at the major cultural divide that goes all the way back to here. And the major cultural divide is the understanding of the land. The English understanding of land ownership was that land could only belong to you if you used it productively, i.e. farmed it. If you didn't use it productively, i.e. farm it, it actually reverted to the common ground, common land and to common ownership. They didn't recognize that. So Native Americans who didn't have this understanding of individual ownership of plots of land, they held all land in common, didn't get that, didn't understand that, and that led to a major cultural argument, just those two different concepts of land ownership. And I'm not going to get into most people are aware of the various and sundry massacres here. The Indians get their moment, the Native Americans have their triumph at Bighorn, but then of course there is the defeat at Wounded Knee, and there are other, Sand Creek, etc. It's a long and bloody history. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 is an interesting little subset of the 1924 Immigration Act that we're going to take a look at in part 5, and that was Representative Homer Snyder of New York State. Interestingly enough, they just granted United States citizenship to all Native Americans blanket as a gratitude for Native Americans having served in the American military during World War I. Not all Native Americans were thrilled by that, because that would imply that they were no longer citizens of their own sovereign nations. And this is a complicated topic. And if you go to the Seneca Museum in Salamanca, New York, there's a large display about this argument, and one of it has to do with the lacrosse team and what passports would they use. As recently as, I think, 2006, 2008, again, don't hold me on the date, could they go to the international lacrosse tournament using Iroquoian passports, or must they use American passports? Interestingly enough, the United States government was amenable to them doing that, but other countries wouldn't recognize it. It gets very complicated. But the Indian Citizenship Act actually gives a direct, well, it was from, well, there's no other way to phrase it. From the mainstream white position, it was looked upon as a gesture of gratitude. From the Native American position, it was looked upon as an attack on the sovereignty of their own nations. And so that's an ongoing thing. Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, 1968, here's that year again. It's uncanny how many things happened in that year. You have the founding of the American Indian movement, I'm not going to make the analogy that the American Indian movement is the NAACP, but it was an organized movement for the civil rights of Native and indigenous peoples. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1968, more commonly known and more generally known as the Fair Housing Act, but there's a major portion in that granting to Native Americans their civil rights. Actually, Titles 2 through 7 of that make sure that the Bill of Rights applies to all Native Americans. It had not been guaranteed before. And that kind of takes us back to the Citizenship Act of what sovereign entity are Native Indigenous Americans citizens of, the United States or their nation, and which of those two takes precedence. In any event, the American Civil Rights, the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 is a major moment. And then 1998, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which gave Native Americans, again, we get into this sovereignty issue that's very subtle and complex, and we're surfing things here rather rapidly today, of which sovereign entity has precedence. And it's been pretty well established in law that the United States government has precedence, but that's still contended. Actually, one of the things is it created, therefore, that the gambling was, in 1998, generally illegal around the country, but on Native American sovereign-owned land, they could do what they wanted, and they decided they would legalize gambling. And you have, and I'm collapsing a complicated thing into about a 20-second soundbite here, the beginning of casino culture, which has a major impact, though, on all the rest of this, because now the Native American entities, the tribes, have money. And that, in American politics, changes everything. And so that is a fascinating and admittedly extremely short and hurried walk through that. Let's go back to the Trail of Tears, probably the most famous and arguably, if we're going to talk about, history, and I think you have to tell the history as accurately and truthfully as possible. And I'm a little self-conscious of that word accurately just now because I'm going fast, and there's Murphy's Law. There will be someone listening who probably knows more about some of these particulars than I do. So apologizing in advance for any misstatements there. But you could argue, do we tell the story or do we pretend it didn't happen? Well, you can't pretend it didn't happen because everyone knows it happened. And as a matter of fact, there are still descendants of the survivors here who bear witness to the fact that it happened. So one of the more, I'm not sure what the word I want is, maybe ignominious episodes in American history, and is in fact what happened to the Native Americans, the indigenous people of what is now the states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, the southeastern United States, north of the Florida Panhandle. North of the Florida Peninsula. You tend not to think of Florida as a peninsula because it's a very big peninsula, but in point of fact, that's kind of what it is. But north of Florida, and of course, that's not a particularly glorious episode. It begins with the Treaty of New York in 1790, signed by Henry Knox on behalf of President Washington, and it essentially gave the land that is West Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi to the Creek Indians in a in an agreement with Alexander Macgillivray, who was the Creek leader of the time. But there were Creeks who didn't even want that, and you have the Creek War of 1813-14, which was a civil war inside of that, sometimes known as the Red Stick War, and that was factions of different members of the Creek tribe, some of whom wanted to make peace with the emerging United States and others who didn't. And of course, one of the things that happened is, and this is where you get into where it really gets not particularly pleasant, many of the Creeks had accepted becoming part of the United States. They became farmers, civilized, and Christianized. Unfortunately, they were sitting on some very valuable land that a lot of other people wanted. Would strike some as paternalistic, perhaps others as not. Johnson versus McIntosh was a famous legal case in which it was decided that no Native American could sell land directly to a white man, only could sell it to the federal government, and it could then be sold by the government. That became a big point of contention. We have the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where essentially Andrew Jackson made his second great appearance on the stage. Of course, the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, essentially ending the Creek Wars and establishing the hegemony of the federal government and the emerging state of Georgia, which led to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, another ignominious moment in the career of Andrew Jackson, in which the Native Americans were just simply forced off of their land then seized and sold to white settlers, and it becomes Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. The Native Americans were then exiled to Oklahoma, or what was then called the Indian Territory, and that was finally settled in 1835 with the Treaty of New Dakota, which stabilized that. The Creeks signed off, sold their land in the east of the Mississippi, and in a forced exodus were marched to Oklahoma, where thousands of them died along the way, and that ended in 1836. Now you'd say, well, that's a tragic episode in American history, but you know, it's the past is past, and what are we going to do about that? Well, the facts are, as Faulkner would tell us, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. One of the small provisions of the Treaty of New Dakota was that the Cherokee Nation had rights to representation in Congress. And in August of 2019, to Kimberly Teehee, on behalf of the Cherokee Nation in what is now the state of Oklahoma, they demanded that representation in Congress. And in a major court decision earlier this year in 2020, that original treaty was upheld. And one of the interesting things, and this would be a fascinating episode, particularly if we could convince one of our legal experts, one of our legal Jeffersonians, who's a legal expert, to help us do a little dive into it. But that language of that treaty is so complex, it is now an open argument about who owns eastern Oklahoma. And it would appear, as the Native Americans like to remind us, the rivers are still flowing, the grass is still growing, the air is still blowing on our Native American treaties. It would appear that actually the Creeks own most of what is now the state of Oklahoma. And so that was a very quick and hopefully semi-coherent walk through Native American history. If I was going to summarize it, it's almost impossible to summarize that and to take a position on it. I think I had a colleague, Anne, who is an expert on the indigenous people of the northeastern woodlands, and she and I would talk about this, and we just, it's not possible really to come up with a simple label for it. Is it a conquest? Yeah, it's a conquest. Is it a theft? Well, that's an interesting word in international relations. But the facts of the matter is, we are still dealing with, we're still dealing with this reality And I do think in the interest of justice, we still need, there's a lot of things here that need to be sorted out. And I don't think it makes anything less of American history. I think that in all three of these stories that we're going to talk about today, the first step in any therapeutic exercise is to confront the facts on the ground. What actually happened? What's going on in this relationship? And given that, how do we move forward? Which is my kind of long-winded way of saying I don't have a simple answer.
Well, these are not simple topics, Dr. Roth, that we're taking a look at, but I think the distinguishing factor here, and you were looking at the words conquest or theft, is that here we grapple with the idea of a people are already populating a place to which a new people show up and claim it as theirs, and then work to engage in some sort of dialogue of whose land really is this. And we see as you mentioned earlier, the continued pushing out of the native peoples, the indigenous peoples, farther and farther west, away from where the colonialists are settling and then expanding. And that's really part of that American appetite of we want to, those who are there, they want to move into more and more of the country. And that has to mean then somebody else has to move out if they're not willing to be assimilated or part of that. But in the interest of time, moving us forward, let's take a look at the next section of this and take a look at African Americans and the role that we're looking there in the American Tapestry Project, because very different, in terms of a people brought against their will to a country.
Right.
And we begin trying to unpack the history there, and what that means for people ending up in a place that they did not choose to come to.
Well, and you're absolutely right. And this could be the Native American topic, the indigenous people, could be something if we do a sixth episode where we don't look at a lot of slides and a lot of information, but try to wrestle with some major questions that come out of it. If in my mind, the major thread in the American story is the ever increasing, ever expanding definition of the we in our founding documents, how do we pull all of ourselves together into some kind of coherent we? The African American history, again, we talked about 1619. I mean, real quickly, that's Sojourner Truth. I assume most people would know Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, but perhaps not. I'm reasonably certain everybody watching today knows who Martin Luther King and Barack Obama is, and of course, that's Harriet Tubman. And again, just like Native Americans, it's impossible to tell this entire history in one slide. The key theme with Native Americans, African Americans, and women that we are going to see in a moment is the excluded have always argued for their inclusion in the American story by appealing to America's foundational ideals of liberty, equality, and freedom. The Native Americans, perhaps whose land we took, their appeal to be included is based upon honoring treaties and just living up to our word. Just do what you said you were going to do. Similarly, with African Americans, as we will hear later when I talk about the women's movement, Martin Luther King and his last speech, just be true to what you said on paper. So that's the important, common thread between these three things. And as we go through all of this information today, I don't want to lose that common thread, that the excluded have always appealed for inclusion, or let me phrase that differently, the excluded have always argued for inclusion by appealing to America's foundational ideals of liberty, equality, and freedom. Well, real quick, major dates. First African slaves, and actually as I look at my own slide, the word slaves may not be entirely accurate in 1619. They were probably indentured servants, but I think we're splitting a pretty fine hair there. But the first Africans arrive in Jamestown in 1619. 1789 to 1860, you have the antebellum America, the constitutional compromise and abolitionism, as we talked last week in Freedom at Home and Abroad and Freedom at Home, the original version of the U.S. Constitution, as far as the originalists are concerned, which could start a major controversy by saying I agree with Joseph Ellis that the whole originalist approach to the Constitution is a load of hogwash, but that just irritated some Federalist Society members. who might be watching. But the original Constitution did have pro-slavery, even though the word was never mentioned, aspects to it. And of course, you have that whole period. We know the Civil War. I'm not going to tell you the Civil War. The second American founding, as it is sometimes called, the three great amendments to the Constitution after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, and 15th. Reconstruction, a period that is hopelessly misunderstood by most people, and even fewer people really understand the redemption. But of course, it's been really interesting these last couple of years as I've been working on this project. When I first started talking about this, I had to explain what the lost cause was because no one had ever heard of it, or that not many had, much less the whole notion of the redemption. And now those two phrases have become quite well known. And so I see that actually as progress. And I'm not going to read every line here in the interest of time, but some basic, major benchmarks: Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which essentially reversed Plessy Ferguson, and separate but equal. Barack Obama is elected president of the United States, but as we have learned through Black Lives Matter and other things, that didn't mean we have a post-racial America. And as I just mentioned earlier, and I hopefully on the screen as I notice some things, the three amendments creating the Second American Revolution, I just went over those. And post Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureaus were established to try to bring the newly freed slaves, newly freed African Americans into American society. And of course, that had mixed results. One, as we're going to see in a moment, an immediate white backlash, an intense and immediate white backlash. The African Americans, the freedmen, never got their 40 acres and a mule to help them set up independent farms. Although Reconstruction had some interesting possibilities. Literacy rates rose dramatically because the newly freed slaves, one of the first things they did was found schools, and so that they could learn the rules and learn how to read and write and become part of the American system, which is all they ever really wanted to be. And there was, at least initially in the 1860s and early 1870s, some dramatic political progress. This gentleman here is Senator Hiram Revels, the first African-American senator from not from North Carolina, the first African-American senator, period. He happened to be from North Carolina. And this is Henry Snyder, the last representative from Congress, from African-American representative in Congress until 1929, and from North Carolina in the 1990s. It was Snyder who in 1900 introduced the first anti-lynching law, which died in committee. And this is actually a group portrait of the first colored senators and U.S. representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congresses immediately after the Civil War. So Reconstruction in its initial incarnation, well, it never succeeded entirely in doing what it was set out to do. And, it's one of those what if moments in history that we don't have, that maybe in an episode 6, had Lincoln lived, would it have turned out differently? Diane Chido, who has presented at the Jefferson, and I have talked about that. And counterfactual arguing tends to drive historians crazy because you can't rewrite it, but as long as you remain aware of the fact that you're engaging in a mental exercise, it can sometimes shed light. And had Lincoln lived and not been succeeded by a racist Southerner who had been put on the ticket in 1864 for short-term political reasons, who knows? History might have been different. But as we know, history wasn't, and it went this way. The defeated white Southerners almost immediately began creating, based, interestingly enough, largely on the Ivanhoe myth, began creating this notion of an aristocratic South of benevolent and benign masters and happy slaves living in an agrarian plantation paradise, symbolized perhaps the most famous example of that is, of course, Gone with the Wind, telling that story. And Heather Cox Richardson and her How the South Won the Civil War, and any number of other people have made the observation that the South, perhaps the North won the actual war, but the North lost the peace. The South rewrote the story. And it's a culture war. And back to culture wars and stories. They rewrote the story. The Redeemers were the southern wing of the Bourbon Democrats. The Bourbon Democrats were the northern Democrats. They were racist and they actually had opposed the Civil War, sometimes called mugwumps. The Redeemers were that. The Redeemers were the southern Democrats who sought redemption, by which they meant the reinstitution of the antebellum pre-Civil War Southern culture, by which they meant white supremacy and a return to political power. The Redeemers opposed the radical Republicans, and particularly they opposed and loathed carpetbaggers, Northerners who had come south to help the freedmen rebuild the South, and scallywags who were Southerners who actually agreed with the carpetbaggers and the occupying Union Army. The scallywags tended to be poor Southern whites, and in a classic divide and conquer, the dominant culture ultimately converted the scallywags. And of course, what drove Redeemers craziest was the notion of a black man voting. And even more particularly, if you look at the line, a black man in a military uniform voting. And that led to Redeemer paramilitary groups. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in the 1860s. In Mississippi, you have the Red Shirts, who took their name from a phrase of that era, waving the bloody shirt. White Southerners accused Northerners who tried to defend the freedmen of waving the bloody shirt. It refers to an episode in Congress that's more myth than fact. And you had numerous anti-black assaults. And all of these attempts here, all of these massacres, etc., followed a similar pattern of the freedmen attempting to exercise their rights and being confronted by violent and militant whites that ended up in battles that actually were more massacres than battles. The basic trope being blacks were attacking and the whites had to protect, but it always turned out that a couple of hundred freed African Americans got killed and 1 or 2 blacks, and that seems to be a common story. In any event, all of that led to, and I guess on October 29th, George Deitch is going to give us a detailed presentation on this, arguably the most corrupt election in American history, the election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio and Samuel Tilden of New York. Hayes was the Republican, Tilden the Democrat. Tilden won the popular vote. 4 states couldn't agree on their electoral college count. Sound familiar in what 2020 could bring. And as a result, a deal was cut. And the deal that was cut essentially gave the Republicans basically, to make a long and complicated story short, and like I said at the beginning of this program, and I'm looking at the time, each of these subsections are could be multiple presentations on them. The radical Republicans, basically, the liberal Republicans, interestingly enough, basically double-crossed the radical Republicans, and in order to seize control, basically shut down Reconstruction and threw the freedmen on their own resources and at the mercy of the emerging Democratic majority, racist Democratic majority in the South. And the 4 conditions was the removal of all remaining U.S. military forces from the former Confederate states, the appointment of at least 1 Southern Democrat to Hayes's cabinet, the construction of another transcontinental railroad using the Texas and Pacific in the South. Essentially, it never got built, by the way, or at least not the way it was envisioned here. It essentially follows the path that the modern day contemporary Interstate 10 follows across the South. There was to be legislation to help industrialize the South and restore its economy. That actually never happened either, but number 5 did. It gave to the Southern states the right to deal with blacks without Northern interference. And of course, that led to Jim Crow and a whole lot of other things. The Redeemers, they controlled the narrative for much of the late 19th and early 20th century, despite Frederick Douglass and John Lynch's best efforts to remind Americans why they had fought the Civil War. The Redeemer school became predominant primarily through a fellow by the name of Archibald Dunning at Columbia and his students, who basically wrote the history of Reconstruction as being a failure, slovenly and marginally civilized blacks, etc. It becomes the story that Thomas Nolan in the Klansman, Thomas Dixon in the Klansman describes, which becomes, of course, the film The Birth of a Nation. By the time you get to the 1930s, W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in America begins to retell that story correctly. And Horace Beale and C. Van Woodward, two other historians, begin also to challenge the Dunning School. And you have that's Eric Foner in the middle, and Eric Foner's Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877, actually tells the story correctly. And of course, you see in the story of Reconstruction exactly what we're talking about in this whole series. Whose story are we talking about? Who has it right? And I like Joe Lepore's definition of history. History is the art of telling a story. History is the art of making an argument about the past by telling a story accountable to evidence. And so people would say, well, how can these stories change and who's right? Well, the stories change because the evidence becomes more deeply available, more widely available, more deeply understood, and you keep refining it until you get it right, until you get a look at it. Coming out of all of that, you have the redeemed South. As we said a minute ago, Jim Crow, there never really was a person Jim Crow. It was a minstrel figure that becomes a proxy or a trope or an icon for the entire black codes, the racist laws of the late 19th century, which last until 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which is essentially the overthrow of the Jim Crow black codes, or the illegalizing of them. 1896, you had Plessy versus Ferguson. I mentioned that earlier. Brown versus Board of Education was in effect the denial of that. You had lynching, that's Ida B. Wells, who is one of the great figures of the late 19th, early 20th century, a founder of the NAACP, but also a fearless anti-lynching advocate. And then you come out of that, of course, the warmth of other suns, the great migration of African Americans north in the early 20th century. And the redeemed South actually does not look like Plantation South. The Plantation South was not a particularly religious area, but you now have that as what became known as the Bible Belt, yet another story. And of course, James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, became the great theme of those who would unredeem the redeemers, let's say. In any event, the women's movement, as I look at the time, and I knew this was going to happen, there's just too much information. We're going to look a little bit at the history of the women's movement from 1848 on to Jeffersonians, Joyce Savacchio and Judy Lynch. I've often make the comment when I use this slide that Erie'ites don't often think of themselves as having their pulse on their finger on the pulse of the future, but there was a moment in time when the two highest political offices in Erie were both occupied by women. And while Joyce and Judy and I are reluctant to say it is the first time or the only time that ever happened, it's got to be one of the rare times and one of the earliest times that ever happened anywhere in the United States. Abigail Adams' famous plea to her husband to remember the ladies and to make sure that they are included in your rights because all men would be tyrants if they could. The key dates in the women's movement begins in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. It also that, of course, is the beginning of the women's movement, but other key dates, 1866, the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Law, is passed by Congress with citizens and voters defined as male in the Constitution, which is important. 1872, Susan B. Anthony cast a vote to test whether the 14th Amendment would be interpreted broadly to guarantee women the right to vote. She is convicted of unlawful voting. President Trump recently, I believe, attempted to pardon her. I don't know if he ever went through with it, but women's movement advocates immediately protested, saying Susan B. Anthony would not want to be pardoned, that she did that explicitly to make a point. And as I said earlier, the women argued for their inclusion, just like the African Americans argued for their inclusion, just like indigenous people, by appealing to America's higher ideals. And in fact, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, and I don't know how many people have ever actually read this, this takes us to 1848 and the women's movement in Seneca Falls, New York. The Women's Declaration of Rights and Sentiments exactly follows the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. One major editing, that all men and women are created equal. And then, just like the original Declaration of Independence, they listed their grievances. Just as Jefferson had listed the grievances against the king, the women list their grievances. Men have never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, to vote. Has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she has no voice. Has made her, if married in the eye of the law, cruelly, civilly dead. Has taken from her all right and property, even to her wages. Made her morally and responsibly the covenant of her husband. She is, in fact, her husband's property. And it's only into the 20th century when women begin to get legal rights. Prior to that, once married, you were the property of your husband. Framed divorce laws upon the supremacy of the man. Education was denied to her. Created a false public sentiment, a double moral code, that men operated by one code and women by another, etc. The Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, we got Mott, Anthony, and Stanton, the three great advocates of that era. They have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges of these United States, and that they expected no small misconception and perhaps ridicule. I'm going fast now, and we'll come back to all of this maybe in a future episode, because the women obviously, absolutely, obviously, I probably spent too much time earlier on one of the other topics.
That's okay, Andy. And if you want to spend more time, we don't need to rush this. We can go a little bit over and make sure we do catch it. And I just want to use this as an opportunity to remind folks that another scholar in residence, who you mentioned earlier, Dr. Judy Lynch, is offering the series right now on Erie County's elected women. While we're honing in on Erie County's turf, we do talk about some of the national issues as well. So another outlet for people to be able to explore this particular topic in the American Tapestry, and maybe yet another future program to get the two of you together to talk this at one time. But Andy, let's get back into this. I appreciate it.
Well, in any event, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, they demanded their immediate admission to all the rights and privileges of citizens of the United States. They anticipated they would get pushback, misconception, misrepresentation, and ridicule. I'll let the women in the audience explain to their significant others or male friends what exactly is meant by the gaze and the hypocrisy of the double moral standards. As I look at this, I mean, Oberlin was the first college in the United States to admit women, but as a general rule, higher education was denied to them. The laws of divorce were all tilted against women. It was practically impossible to get a divorce. And the notion that the woman could not own property. The only way to own property was to actually have never been married and inherited it from your father and then never married, or to be a widow. And so you own nothing, and you actually, in many ways, didn't own yourself. In fact, somewhere in here, and to administer chastisement. Now, in the age of domestic abuse being a major social issue that is being adjudicated and finally dealt with, it takes a little bit of a stretch of imagination to go back to a time where, well, it was never technically legal exactly, because assault and battery is assault and battery. But inside of a marriage, there was a kind of ambiguous attitude towards it, shall we say. The precedent of the master. And this is all, of course, in the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. 67 women and 32 men, 67 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Rights. Of course, perhaps the most famous women who signed it were Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But amongst the men who signed it was Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass and Stanton and Mott, their relationship was very complicated, because Douglass was advocating for the rights of African Americans, and this was still in a male-dominated world. He thought it was more important to get male African Americans the right to vote and totally enfranchised, and the women would have to wait their turn. But he did sign the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. It's more complicated than that little synopsis just made it, but I'm not that far off. In any event, some more key dates. 1890, the first state, Wyoming, grants women the right to vote. One of my personal favorites, Jeanette Rankin from Montana, is the first female member of Congress. Margaret Sanger founds Planned Parenthood. And one of the interesting things about Margaret Sanger is that women's rights, women's legal rights, and women's reproductive rights are hopelessly intertwined. And we see that to this day in politics, in terms of abortion and in terms of contraception. Those two issues go in tandem. Frances Perkins was the first woman to be a member of a presidential cabinet. She was Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. Of course, this year we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And as early as 1923, the first version of an Equal Rights Amendment is introduced. And in fact, the Equal Rights Amendment is still slogging along and may actually make it. That's, in the interest of time, I could go off for about 5 minutes in the history of that. That's an interesting exploration of politics. But you'll notice here, I got 1923, and you don't really have a serious talk about women's rights again until 1963 and the beginning of what is sometimes called second wave feminism with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Equal pay is passed by Congress, and then 64, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits sex discrimination in employment. And I just mentioned about contraception. This might come to some younger viewers, auditors of this, somewhat amazing. Might even come to some people my own vintage, that contraception was not made legal until 1965 in Griswold versus Connecticut. And let me explain that when I say it was not made legal. It was not made legal in federal law, and since federal law has precedence over state law, prior to Griswold versus Connecticut, individual states could have banned contraception. Griswold versus Connecticut prohibited that, so that for the first time nationally contraception is legal. And again, it might startle some people to realize that as well. To me, it's recent. To other people, it's ancient history. But to as recently as 1965, you couldn't walk into Giant Eagle and see a rack of contraceptive items, whereas today it's a non-issue, we think. I jumped over something here. Jill Lepore has an interesting argument that during that 40-year gap, the women's movement was kept alive. Interestingly enough, that Wonder Woman was a stealth women's equality fighter. And that's an interesting story that we don't have time for today, but I'll just throw that out there. So as a result of all of that, you have this slide, which as recently, to use 1968 as a placeholder for the sake of argument, this slide would have been impossible in 1968 if it weren't for what happened during the women's movement that came out, second wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm not going to go over all of those, but Kamala Harris is running for vice president, Hillary Clinton, the first woman to run for president. Virginia Romedy is the chief executive officer of IBM. Paula Hawkins was the first woman elected to the Senate in her own right. That is, she did not take a seat because her husband died. She is a Republican from Florida. Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman elected to Congress. And of course, Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And arguably the greatest American novelist of the last half of the 20th century was Toni Morrison. But there were people who fought against that. And we have white nationalism. People who all of this progress they found abhorrent. And white supremacy, the belief or theory that white people are inherently superior, is in the Naturalization Act of 1790. Citizenship was limited to free white persons of good character. By definition, it excluded Native Americans, indentured servants, slaves, free blacks and Asians, etc. Two early expressions of it, John C. Calhoun said, "I hold slavery to be a positive good." I've remarked on a number of occasions that perhaps the most notorious example of those who would deny people inclusion, denying our foundational ideals, was Alexander Stephens. That's him, the Vice President of the Confederacy's cornerstone speech, in which he said, "The cornerstone of their new government rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." And as I've said a couple of times throughout this, the excluded have appealed for their inclusion. The excluded have argued for their inclusion by appealing to America's foundational ideals, and those who would exclude them have denied those foundational ideals, which actually raises the interesting question, who's the patriot? White supremacy's roots, the infamous Dred Scott case, in which Roger B. Tanity, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said that black people had no rights a white man was obligated to respect. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. We get into Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, the pseudoscience of eugenics, and of course, the Immigration Act of 1924 that we'll come back to in the Immigrant's Tale in Part 5. And this has all led to white supremacy. And I would point out, as we talked just before we began, that even though there's been this great fear of left-wing terrorism and actually of Islamic terrorism, that almost every example of 20th century terrorism has been from the radical white right wing. In the Manual African Methodist Church in Charleston, the Unite the Right Rally, Tree of Life Massacre in Pittsburgh, Walmart in El Paso, Texas. So that's a real quick sprint through the end of that, and we'll come back to it in future ones. But I think the ideals of liberty, freedom, equality, and opportunity are still holding, because that's why all of these people are still coming. This is from the Erie Times News in 2019. That's a new citizen naturalization exercise in the federal courthouse. Next week, we'll be talking about the American dream and the pursuit of success. So thank you.
Dr. Roth, I want to thank you. We gave you the unenviable task of trying to go through so much in so little time. The more and more we continue this, the more and more I think we've got to do a Talking Tapestry episode where we get a chance to revisit this, come back with our viewers and take their questions and walk through it. Because again, we're looking at really big issues, and I think you frame that insightfully at the end of, if this is the case, if there's such pushback and there has been so many obstacles put in front of those who are trying to be part of America's story, why do we still see people wanting to come to America, wanting to be part of what it is our country has built, is building, and is fixing and adjusting as time goes on?
And that's because those values of liberty, freedom, equality, and opportunity are, in fact, Thomas Paine was right, they're universal. And while we have fumbled on occasion, I think over the arc of our history, as Martin Luther King and John Meacham said, it does in fact bend towards inclusion and justice, but it doesn't mean it's a sure thing, and it doesn't mean it's an easy thing.
Well, and Dr. Roth, I think that goes back to one of the Joel Lepore quotes that you mention often about, or it might have been Heather Cox Richardson. I know one of them you mentioned the idea of what is history and how do we tell it, and getting the most facts that we can and turning our attention to that. And we have ignored portions of our history for far too long, and now we are turning an eye to them, especially here with you in this program. So I, for one, want to thank you, Dr. Andrew Roth, scholar in residence at the Jefferson Educational Society and host of the American Tapestry Project on WQLN Public Media, with episodes available on the NPR One app and WQLN.org. Thank you so much for the work you're doing, for joining us here in this conversation where folks can unpack the American Tapestry Project episode by episode. already looking forward to our next installment where we take a look at the hustlers of America, the business, how we look at ourselves economically, what it means to be an American. Thank you to all of you for watching along at home, whether you're tuning in live, watching this on the Jefferson Educational Society's Facebook page, or watching or listening to a later broadcast of this. We are grateful for you. We look forward to welcoming Dr. Roth back next week, same time, Tuesdays at noon, live on the Jefferson Educational Society Facebook page. But all of these videos are available on demand at jeserie.org, where you can catch up on these episodes and so many other programs that we've had the chance to host. To catch that other discussion, including looks at 1968, to read Dr. Roth's book notes series, do head over to jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speg, and be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.